The Ashton County auction house smelled like sawdust, sweat, and something stale, like an old wooden crate left out in the rain too long. Ethan Cole leaned against the back wall, arms crossed, the sleeves of his worn-out denim jacket rolled up despite the heat from the buzzing overhead lights. He hadn't planned on coming here. In fact, he hadn't set foot in Ashton County for weeks. But old habits die hard. And when he spotted a flyer about a livestock auction pinned to the notice board at the gas station, he figured it might be worth a look. His farm could always use a few new supplies, maybe a spare generator or some replacement fencing. He wasn't the kind to stay in town longer than necessary. Too many ghosts lingered in places like this, ghosts of a past he had no intention of digging up. The people here still remembered his old man, and they still whispered about the Cole name in ways that made Ethan clench his fists. But tonight, he was just another man in the crowd watching the auction unfold. The auctioneer's voice rang through the tin-roofed building, rattling off bids like an overworked train conductor. Lot 45, 3-year-old mare, gentle temperament. We'll start the bidding at $800. Ethan barely paid attention. His eyes drifted over the crowd. Ranchers, farmhands, and a few families with eager-eyed kids hoping to take home a pet. The rhythm of the auction was familiar, predictable. Horses, cattle, even a few goats. But then something changed. A murmur rippled through the room as a new lot was led into the ring. Not a horse, not a cow, a dog. At first glance, he barely looked like a living thing. The border collie lay flat on his side in the middle of the concrete ring, ribs poking through a scruffy coat, marred by dirt and scars. His coat was dull, and his limbs were thin, almost fragile. His chest rose and fell with slow, shallow breaths, as if just existing took effort. "The hell's that?" someone muttered. The auctioneer adjusted his microphone and cleared his throat. Lot 47, stray dog, found wandering outside the old mill. No papers, no known history. Starting bid, $50. Silence. Dry chuckle broke through the hush. $50 for a bag of bones? Ethan's jaw tightened. He'd seen that kind of indifference before. Not just toward animals, but toward people, too. He had spent years learning to recognize it. The way people looked past the things they didn't want to deal with. The way they pretended broken things weren't worth fixing. The auctioneer sighed and tapped his gavel. "Come on, folks, give the poor thing a chance." Still no one moved. A teenage boy elbowed his friend. "Maybe he's a ghost dog," he whispered, barely suppressing a laugh. "More like a walking skeleton," the friend snickered. Ethan shifted his boot against the floor, the sound sharp enough to cut through the murmuring crowd. "I'll take him?" Heads turned. The auctioneer squinted past the lights. 50? 20, Ethan said, his voice flat. A ripple of laughter moved through the small crowd. "Ain't worth 20 cents, a man muttered. 20, Ethan repeated, locking eyes with the auctioneer. It wasn't a negotiation. The gavel came down. Sold. $20 to the gentleman in the back. Ethan ignored the murmurs. He stepped forward, focusing only on the dog. Up close, the collie's condition was even worse. Raw skin where a collar had rubbed him raw, patches of fur missing, and a dull, distant stare that barely seemed alive. A woman approached, Madeline Brooks, the local shelter manager. She held a clipboard, her expression laced with guilt. "He's a tough case," she said softly. "We picked him up a few months ago, but no one claimed him. He's been in and out of the shelter, but we're at capacity. He doesn't do well." In the kennels, Ethan took the clipboard, barely glancing at the waiver before scrawling his signature. "What's his name?" he asked. "The shelter just called him Scout," Madeline said, "but he doesn't respond to much." Ethan nodded. "He'll come around?" Madeline's gaze was skeptical. "Dogs like him. They don't always bounce back." Ethan glanced down at the collie, his expression softening for just a moment. "Neither do people like me." The auction carried on behind them, but Ethan crouched down, resting his arms on his knees. His voice was quiet, steady. "You're okay now, buddy." The dog didn't flinch, didn't react at all, just lay there, like something left behind. Too many times to care. Ethan didn't push, didn't tug on the leash hanging loose around the dog's neck. He just waited. Finally, with a slow, barely perceptible movement, Scout's tail twitched. It wasn't trust. Not yet. But it was something. By the time Ethan walked out of the auction house, the night had cooled. The air smelled of damp earth and the distant scent of hay. His old Ford truck sat in the gravel lot, the rust along the wheel wells catching in the dim light of the street lamp. He opened the passenger door, but Scout didn't move. Ethan sighed. He crouched down again, slow and careful. "All right, pal. I get it. The world's been a hell of a place for you." He reached out, but he didn't grab. Just let his fingers hover near the dog's shoulder. Scout didn't flinch, but his breathing changed just slightly. Ethan didn't rush him. Eventually he scooped up the collie, expecting dead weight. But the moment he lifted him, the dog tensed, muscles locking like steel cables. A sharp, weak growl rumbled from his throat. Ethan didn't let go. "Easy," he murmured. "I got you." The growl faded. The tension in Scout's body didn't, but he let himself be placed onto the worn-out seat of the truck. Ethan closed the door carefully, before walking around to the driver's side. As he slid into the seat and turned the key, the old truck rattled to life. He glanced at Scout, whose dark eyes reflected the glow of the dashboard lights. "Home's about 20 minutes away," Ethan said, more to himself than the dog. "You'll like it. Quiet, no crowds, no ghosts," he didn't say. The truck rumbled down the dirt road, disappearing into the night. For the first time in a long time, Ethan didn't drive alone. The old Ford truck rumbled down the uneven road, its worn-out shocks groaning with every pothole. The radio played a low country tune, but Ethan barely heard it over the hum of the tires against gravel. His eyes flickered toward the passenger seat, where Scout lay curled up as small as his frail body would allow. The dog didn't move much. He wasn't panting, wasn't looking around, just staring at the dashboard like he was bracing for something. Ethan knew that look. He'd seen it in people before. Resignation, like they were just waiting for the next bad thing to happen. "You're all right," he murmured, his fingers tapping against the steering wheel. "No one's gonna hurt you, bud." Scout didn't react, but Ethan wasn't expecting him to. It would take time. They pulled up to the farm a few minutes later, the headlights cutting through the fog rolling in over the fields. The old barn stood tall in the moonlight, its paint peeling but its frame solid. Beyond it, the farmhouse sat dark except for the porch light Ethan had left on. It wasn't much, a simple two-bedroom place with a wraparound porch, but it was home. He killed the engine and turned to the dog. "Are you ready?" Silence. Ethan sighed and pushed the door open. Gravel crunched beneath his boots as he stepped out, then rounded the truck to the passenger side. He opened the door, waiting. Scout didn't move. "All right, I get it," Ethan muttered, crouching down beside the open door. "New place, new smells, kinda overwhelming, huh?" The collie's eyes darted to him for a split second before flicking away. Ethan reached out, slow and steady. "I'm not gonna make you, but I'd really appreciate it if you—" Before he could finish, Scout scrambled out of the truck, his thin legs trembling as his paws hit the dirt. For a second, Ethan thought he might bolt, but instead, the dog just stood. There, his body tight, his tail low. Ethan gave him space. He stood up, stretching, and walked toward the porch like nothing was unusual. "Come on," he said over his shoulder. "House is warmer than sleeping out here." He left the door open as he stepped inside. The warmth from the old wood stove greeted him instantly, filling the house with the scent of burning oak. It wasn't fancy, but it was cozy. Worn furniture, shelves lined with books, and an old quilt draped over the couch. A dog bed sat near the fireplace, left over from Duke, his late Labrador retriever. Ethan hadn't had the heart to get rid of it. He turned to see if Scout had followed. The dog stood just outside the threshold, his head low. His paws barely touched the welcome mat, like there was an invisible barrier keeping him from stepping in. Ethan didn't push. "You take your time," he said. Then, as if he weren't paying attention, he moved to the kitchen, grabbing a can of dog food and popping it open. The scent filled the air instantly. Beef and rice, nothing fancy but better than whatever scraps Scout had been surviving on. Ethan scooped it into a metal bowl and set it on the floor. Then he stepped back. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, Scout took a hesitant step inside. His nails clicked against the wooden floor, his body low as he crept toward the food like he expected it to be yanked away at any moment. Ethan stayed still. Then, as soon as the dog reached the bowl, he devoured it. Not like a normal dog. Not like one that knew food would always be there. No, Scout ate like it was the first meal he'd had in days, like he didn't trust that there would be more. Ethan's throat tightened. "Take it easy, bud," he murmured. But he didn't stop. He just waited. When the food was gone, Scout licked the bowl clean, his ribs heaving with each breath. Ethan knelt down, resting his elbows on his knees. "There's more where that came from," he said softly. "No need to rush." The collie lifted his head, staring at him for the first time. Not past him, not through him. At him. A flicker of something flashed in those tired eyes. Hope, maybe. Or disbelief. Ethan didn't know which, but he'd take it. That night, Ethan settled into bed, exhaustion weighing heavy on his bones. It had been a long day, longer than he'd planned, but he wasn't asleep for long. The scratching started just past midnight. At first it was faint, a hesitant scrape against the wooden floor. Then a soft whimper. Ethan blinked, sitting up. The dim light from the stove cast long shadows across the room. He turned toward the doorway. Scout stood there, barely visible in the low light. The dog was shaking. Ethan swung his legs over the bed and stood slowly. "Hey," he whispered. "You okay?" The collie's ears twitched, but he didn't move. Ethan took a step forward, then another. He didn't crouch this time, didn't reach out. Instead, he just stood there, close enough to be near, but far enough to let Scout make the next move. And after a long, tense moment, he did. The dog took a shaky step forward, then another. Then, to Ethan's complete surprise, he pressed his thin body against his leg. For a moment, Ethan didn't breathe. Then, carefully, he knelt down, resting a hand on the dog's head. "You're safe," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. Scout let out a slow, tired sigh, and for the first time he leaned into the touch. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The next morning, Ethan woke up to the soft rhythm of rain against the roof. Scout was curled up on the rug near the foot of the bed, his body relaxed for the first time since arriving at the farm. His breathing was steady, no longer the shallow, wary gasps of an animal expecting the worst. Ethan stretched, rubbing his face before glancing at the clock. 6:12 a.m. Early, but not unusual. He was used to farm life, where the days started before the sun and ended long after it disappeared. What was unusual, however, was the feeling in the house. For the first time in a long time, it wasn't empty. He watched Scout for a few more seconds, then stood, careful not to make too much noise. He didn't want to startle him. But as the floor creaked under his weight, the collie's eyes snapped open. His body tensed, muscles coiled like a spring. Ethan immediately froze. "Easy," he murmured, keeping his voice low and steady. "Just me." Scout's ears twitched. He didn't move, didn't growl, but his entire body was stiff with uncertainty. Ethan sighed. 2 steps forward, 1 step back. That was how it was going to be. Instead of pushing, he moved to the kitchen, giving the dog space to decide when. He was ready to follow. He started a pot of coffee, grabbed a pan, and cracked a few eggs onto the stove. As the butter sizzled, the warm scent filled the small house. Out of the corner of his eye, he caught Scout inching toward the doorway. "That's right, bud," Ethan muttered. "Come see what breakfast smells like." The collie stayed just outside the room, head low, watching him with sharp, calculating eyes. He still didn't trust easily, but the lure of food was stronger than fear. Ethan plated his eggs and pulled. Another can of food from the pantry. He scooped it into Scout's bowl and set it on the floor before sitting down at the table with his own meal. He didn't rush him, didn't talk, just ate. A minute passed, then another. Finally, Scout crept forward, slow and hesitant. He sniffed the food first, looking between Ethan and the bowl, as if expecting some kind of trick. Ethan didn't move. Then, after another long pause, the dog started eating. This time, he didn't inhale it like he thought it might disappear. He still ate fast, but there was a hesitation, a moment where he looked up between bites, checking to see if Ethan would take it away. He didn't. "That's how it works here," Ethan said, taking another bite of eggs. "You don't have to fight for your meals. No one's taking it from you." For the first time since he brought him home, Scout's tail twitched. It wasn't much, but it was something. By late morning, the rain had stopped, leaving the ground damp and the air crisp. Ethan grabbed his boots and headed for the barn, expecting Scout to stay behind. Instead, he heard the quiet tap, tap, tap of paws on the porch behind him. He glanced. Over his shoulder, Scout stood at the threshold of the open door, eyes flickering between Ethan and the yard. "You want to come?" Ethan asked, pausing. The dog didn't move, but he didn't retreat either. Ethan decided to test something. He took a step forward, then stopped. Scout's ears perked slightly. Ethan took another step, another pause. Then, Scout took a step, too. Ethan exhaled. Progress. They moved slowly at first. Scout never got closer than a few feet, always keeping enough space to bolt if he needed to. But he followed. That was more than Ethan had expected. By the time they reached the barn, Ethan was already planning his next move. He kept things casual, moving through his usual morning chores, feeding the horses, checking the fence line, and the entire time Scout followed, watching, waiting, maybe, just maybe, learning to trust. Ethan had just finished mucking out one of the stalls when he heard the rumble of an engine coming up the driveway. He frowned, tossing the shovel against the wall. Not many people came out this way unless they had a reason. The truck that pulled up was familiar. Travis Miller, one of the local deputies. Ethan wiped his hands on his jeans and stepped onto the porch as Travis climbed out of his truck, adjusting his belt. "Morning," Travis greeted, nodding toward him. Ethan crossed his arms. "Something I should be worried about," Travis smirked. "Not yet." That didn't put Ethan at ease. The deputy glanced past him, eyes landing on Scout, who was peering around the side of the house. "That the dog from the auction?" Travis asked. Ethan nodded. "Yeah, he looks better already. He's getting there." Travis let out a breath, shifting his weight. "Listen," he said, scratching the back of his head. "I wasn't going to say anything, but someone's been asking around about that dog." Ethan's shoulders stiffened. "Who?" Travis shrugged. "Don't know, got a call at the station last night. Guy wouldn't leave his name, just asked if the collie from the auction was still alive." Ethan's fingers twitched at his side. "That's not a normal question." "No, it's not," Travis agreed. A long pause stretched between them. Ethan's gut told him something wasn't right. People didn't just call about a stray, not unless that stray was more than just a dog. "You want me to look into it?" Travis asked. Ethan exhaled slowly. "Yeah, find out who's asking." Travis nodded. "I'll keep you posted." As the deputy turned to leave, Scout let out a low, barely audible growl. Travis glanced back, raising an eyebrow. "Seems like he knows something we don't." Ethan didn't answer, because he had the same feeling. That evening, Ethan sat on the porch, staring at the horizon. The sky had darkened, painted in streaks of orange and deep purple. The land stretched out before him, quiet and still. But his mind wasn't still. Someone was looking for Scout, and something told him they weren't looking for a reunion. Behind him, the dog lay curled near the door, his head resting on his paws. His body was still tense, but he wasn't hiding anymore. Ethan sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know what happened to you, bud," he murmured, "but we'll figure it out." The collie's tail flicked once. Ethan smiled, slightly one step at a time. The night settled over the farm like a heavy blanket, wrapping everything in stillness. But Ethan wasn't at ease. Travis's visit earlier in the day had planted something in his gut, a gnawing unease that refused to leave. Someone had been asking about Scout, and whoever they weren't looking for a lost pet. Ethan sat on the porch, one boot resting on the railing, an old mug of coffee cooling in his hands. The farmhouse was dark, except for the soft glow of the lantern, hanging above the porch. He didn't turn on the big floodlights. If someone was watching, he wanted to see them first. Scout lay nearby, his head resting on his paws, but his ears twitched at every little sound, the rustling of the wind through the trees, the distant hoot of an owl. He was alert, even if his body was still. Ethan sighed, taking a slow sip of his coffee. "How you feel it too, huh?" The collie's ears perked slightly, but he didn't lift his head. Ethan smirked. "Didn't take you long to turn into a guard dog." A month ago, Scout had been a skeletal, broken animal lying in the dirt of an auction house, waiting for someone, anyone, to care. Now, even though he still had miles to go, he was already different, stronger. But Ethan wasn't sure that was a good thing. He set his mug down and stretched his legs, trying to shake off the tension coiling in his shoulders. "Come on, bud, let's call it a night." Scout hesitated, his gaze flicking toward the darkness beyond the porch. He stayed like that for a moment, watching something Ethan couldn't see. Ethan frowned. "What is it?" A long pause, then Scout let out a low growl. It wasn't loud, wasn't frantic, just a deep warning rumble like the quiet before a storm. Ethan stood slowly, scanning the yard. His eyes flickered to the tree line near the fence. then to the gravel driveway leading back toward the road. Nothing moved. Nothing made a sound. But Scout wouldn't growl at nothing. Ethan reached behind him, grabbing the rifle he kept leaning against the wall near the door. He wasn't taking chances. He stepped off the porch, boots crunching against the gravel. Scout rose to his feet, his body tense, but he didn't bark. Didn't charge. Smart dog. Ethan kept his steps slow and deliberate as he walked toward the fence line. The night air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of damp earth from the earlier rain. A soft breeze rustled the grass. Still, nothing. Maybe he was being paranoid. Maybe a sound. Soft, almost imperceptible. The crunch of gravel under a footstep. Ethan froze. His grip tightened on the rifle. His eyes scanned the shadows, searching, waiting. And then, just at the edge of the yard, a figure moved. Ethan didn't hesitate. He raised the rifle. "You got about 3 seconds to tell me who you are." Silence. Then a low chuckle. "Well now," a voice drawled. "Didn't think you'd be the trigger-happy type, Cole." Ethan's grip didn't loosen. "Step into the light." The man did. Slowly. He was tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a dark jacket that looked expensive but well-worn. His hair was slicked back, and there was a smirk on his face that Ethan didn't like one bit. Behind him, another figure lingered. A younger guy, maybe early 20s, arms crossed over his chest. Ethan didn't lower the gun. "Name," he demanded. The older man sighed dramatically. "Vincent Holloway." He gestured toward the younger one. "And this here is my son, Jason." Ethan's eyes narrowed. "What do you want?" Vincent took a slow step forward. Scout growled again. "Easy there, boy," Vincent said, eyeing the dog with amusement. "No need for all that." Ethan didn't move. "I don't like repeating." "Myself." Vincent sighed again. "Fine, I'll make it simple. I'm looking for a dog." Ethan's stomach clenched. Vincent's eyes flickered to Scout. That one, to be exact. Ethan kept his face unreadable. "Not for sale." Vincent chuckled, shaking his head. "I don't think you understand, Cole. He's mine." Scout's body went rigid. His ears flattened and his tail tucked slightly. He knew this man. Ethan's grip tightened on the rifle. That dog was auctioned off, legally, paid for and signed over. "He's mine now." Vincent's smirk faded just a little. "You don't know what you got." "I know exactly what I've got," Ethan shot back. "A dog that was dumped at an auction like trash." Jason shifted behind his father, impatience flickering across his face. "Dad, let's just—" Vincent held up a hand. "No need to rush, son." His eyes met Ethan's again, colder now, calculating. "I'll pay you. Triple what you paid." "No. 5 times." Ethan's jaw clenched. "He's not for sale." Vincent's smirk returned, but there was an edge to it now. "You're making a mistake, Cole." Ethan took a slow step forward, his voice deadly calm. "No, I think you did when you let that dog go." A long silence stretched between them. Finally, Vincent exhaled through his nose. "All right, have it your way." He turned, moving toward the truck. Jason hesitated before following. But before getting in, Vincent glanced back. "You take care of that dog," he said, voice laced with something that almost sounded like a threat. "I'd hate for something to happen to him." Ethan didn't answer. He just stood there watching as their truck pulled out onto the road and disappeared into the darkness. Scout was still trembling. Ethan knelt beside him, resting a steady hand on his back. "You know them, don't you, Bothiki?" Collie didn't react right away, but then slowly he pressed his head against Ethan's side. Ethan exhaled. This wasn't over. Not even close. Ethan barely slept that night. He sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the wall, his mind racing. Vincent Holloway wasn't just some rich guy looking for a lost pet. No, he wanted Scout for a reason, and whatever that reason was, it wasn't good. Scout lay curled up at the foot of the bed, his breathing steady, but Ethan could still feel the tension in him. Even in sleep, his body remained tight, ready to run if he had to. Ethan clenched his jaw. Not anymore. That dog had been through hell, and he wasn't about to let him go back. He exhaled, rubbing a hand down his face. If Holloway came back, things would get ugly. Ethan had dealt with men like him before, smooth talkers with money and power, used to getting what they wanted. And when they didn't, they made sure you regretted it. But Ethan wasn't scared. He had fought battles before, and this time he wasn't fighting alone. The next morning, Ethan headed into town. He wasn't about to wait around for Vincent to make the next move. Scout rode in the truck beside him, his head low but his ears flicking toward every noise. He was still wary, still waiting for something to go wrong. But when Ethan reached over and gave his head a quick scratch, the collie blinked up at him, uncertain but steady. "You're all right, bud," Ethan murmured. "We've got this." By the time they pulled up to the Ashton County Sheriff's Office, Ethan already had a plan forming in his head. Deputy Travis Miller was standing outside, sipping his coffee, when Ethan slammed the truck door shut. Travis raised an eyebrow. "Well, you look like a man with a problem." "Damn right I do," Ethan said. Travis took another sip, unfazed. "Let me guess. Holloway?" Ethan leaned against the cruiser. "You already knew?" Travis sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "Word gets around, a guy like that, he doesn't just let things go. My gut says he's not done with you yet." Ethan's hands clenched into fists. "I'm not giving him the dog," I figured. Travis set his coffee down on the hood of his cruiser, crossing his arms. "Look, I can do some digging. See if Holloway has anything shady in his past, but you need to be careful. If he's invested in getting Scout back, he'll try again." Ethan exhaled. "Yeah, I know." Travis narrowed his eyes. "You got a plan?" Ethan nodded. "Yeah, I need to reinforce my property, keep an eye out. But if Holloway or his goons step foot on my land again, I'm not calling you." Travis smirked. "Didn't think you would." The two men stood there for a moment, the weight of what was coming settling between them. Then Travis reached into his jacket and pulled out a business card. "This guy, Ray Parker, private investigator out of Billings, used to work military cases. If Holloway's done something illegal, he'll find it." Ethan took the card and nodded. "Appreciate it." Travis patted the side of Ethan's truck as he stepped back. "Keep your rifle close, Cole." Ethan smirked. "It never leaves my side." By the time Ethan got back to the ranch, he was already working through a checklist in his head. Step 1. Reinforce the perimeter. He spent the next 3 hours checking the fences, adding extra security to the gate, and setting up motion sensor. Lights around the property. Step 2. Surveillance. Ethan had a few old trail cameras from when he used to track wildlife on the property. He set them up in key locations, making sure they covered every entrance, every blind spot. If Holloway tried sneaking onto his land, he'd know. Step 3. Train Scout. Ethan wasn't just going to protect Scout, he was going to teach him to protect himself. That afternoon, Ethan took Scout out to the field, where he had set up a few makeshift training obstacles. The dog was still skittish, still hesitant, but Ethan could tell there was something underneath all that fear, something sharp, something strong. He grabbed a rope toy from the truck and tossed it a few feet ahead. Scout just stared at it. Ethan sighed, crouching down to his level. "You don't know how to play, do you?" The collie's ears twitched. Ethan picked up the rope and held it in front of him. "All right, let's try something else." He gave the rope a light tug, just enough to spark instinct. Scout's eyes flickered. Ethan tugged again. The dog hesitated, then for the first time he grabbed it. Ethan's grin was slow but real. There we go. It wasn't much, but it was the start of something bigger. That night, the storm came. Not just rain, a full-blown tempest. The wind howled through the trees, rain hammered against the windows, and thunder rumbled deep in the distance. Ethan lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. Something was off. The air was too tense, too charged. Scout must have felt it too, because suddenly he was on his feet, ears pinned back, growling. Ethan shot up. "What is it?" Scout didn't answer, but his body was rigid. His eyes were locked on the front door. Then, a noise, a soft click. Ethan's blood ran cold. The gate. Someone was here. Ethan grabbed his rifle and moved to the window, peering out into the darkness. Lightning flashed, and for a split second, he saw them, 2 figures moving toward the barn. Ethan's jaw clenched. Vincent Holloway just made his move. He turned to Scout, his voice low but firm. "Stay close, buddy." Scout didn't hesitate, because this time he wasn't going to run. This time, he was ready to fight. Ethan barely breathed as he watched the 2 figures move through the storm, their shadows flickering in the lightning flashes. The rain poured down in thick sheets, drumming against the roof, masking the sound of their footsteps. He could tell. By the way they moved, they weren't amateurs. They weren't just trespassers looking to steal farm equipment. They were here for Scout. Ethan tightened his grip on the rifle, his heart pounding like a war drum. Beside him, Scout stood rigid, his eyes locked on the intruders, a low, steady growl rising in his throat. Ethan crouched down and whispered, "You ready, bud?" Scout didn't flinch. He was. Ethan moved swiftly, keeping to the shadows as he made his way toward the barn. No direct confrontation, not yet. He needed to see what they were planning. He ducked behind an old tractor, peering through the darkness. Vincent Holloway stood near the barn doors, his expensive jacket soaked from the storm. Jason, his son, stood a few feet away, pulling a crowbar. From his belt, Ethan clenched his jaw. They were going to force their way in. "Just grab the dog," Vincent barked over the rain. "Cole isn't going to stop us." Jason hesitated. "You sure about this? What if he—" Vincent shot him a glare. "He's one guy. We'll be gone before he even knows what happened." Wrong, Ethan thought. Lightning flashed again. It was time to show them just how wrong they were. Ethan moved first. A loud crack split through the storm as he fired a warning shot into the air. The Holloways froze. "Step away from my barn," Ethan called, his voice steady, commanding. "Last chance." Jason spun around, dropping the crowbar with a clatter. Vincent didn't flinch. Instead, he turned slowly, his smirk never wavering. "Evening, Cole," Vincent said smoothly, like they were two old friends meeting for a drink. "No need to. Get all worked up." Ethan took a slow step forward, keeping the rifle trained on him. "You're on my land in the middle of the night with a crowbar. What would you call that?" Vincent chuckled, shaking his head. "I'd call it a misunderstanding." Ethan's finger tightened on the trigger. "I don't misunderstand much." Jason took a step back, his boots splashing in the mud. "Dad—" "Shut up, Jason," Vincent snapped, then turned back to Ethan. "Let's not turn this into something ugly, Cole. I'll make you a deal. You hand over the dog, and we walk away." Ethan's voice was ice cold. "No." Vincent sighed, tilting his head. "You're making this difficult." Ethan didn't blink. "You're the one who came looking for a fight." And just as he said it, Scout moved. The collie had been waiting, watching. He had spent his life running from men like this, cowering, expecting pain, but not anymore. With a snarl, Scout lunged from the shadows, not out of fear, but out of courage. Jason yelped, stumbling backward as Scout snapped his teeth inches from his leg. He scrambled away, falling into the mud, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Vincent's smirk vanished. "Call him off," he snapped. Ethan didn't. Instead, he lowered the rifle, aiming it directly at Holloway's chest. "You and your son are—" "Going to leave," Ethan said, "right now, and if I ever see you on my land again—" He let the silence hang between them, letting Holloway decide how that sentence ended. Vincent clenched his jaw. Then, without a word, he turned. "Jason, let's go." Jason scrambled to his feet, shaking. He shot one last panicked look at Scout, before following his father toward the truck. Vincent paused at the driver's side, looking back over his shoulder. "This isn't over, Cole." Ethan just smirked. "Yeah, it is." Vincent hesitated, then climbed into the truck. The engine roared to life, and with a spray of mud, they peeled away into the storm. Silence settled over the farm. Ethan let out a slow breath. His hands were still steady on the rifle, but his pulse thundered in his ears. Scout stood beside him, chest heaving, eyes locked on the road where the Holloways had disappeared. Ethan knelt down, rubbing his fingers through the dog's damp fur. "You did good, bud." Scout let out a breath, then, for the first time, pressed his head against Ethan's shoulder, not out of fear, out of trust. 2 weeks later, the farm felt different, lighter, safer, like it belonged to both of them now. Ethan had made sure Vincent Holloway wouldn't come back. With the help of Travis and some well-placed legal threats, Vincent was facing trespassing charges, and if he ever so much as looked at Scout again, Ethan would make sure the law wasn't the only thing he had to worry about. But Vincent didn't matter anymore because Scout wasn't afraid anymore. It happened one crisp morning. Ethan was out by the fields working on the fences when he heard something behind him, the patter of paws. He turned, just in time to see Scout racing through the open pasture, his legs stretching, his tail high. Not running away, running because he could, running because he was free. Ethan leaned against the fence, watching as the dog darted through the tall grass, his movements fluid, effortless. He had never seen him like this before, so alive. Scout skidded to a stop a few feet away, panting, his tongue lolling out. Ethan chuckled. "Feel good, huh?" Scout barked, a sharp, eager sound, and for the first time his tail wagged. That night Ethan sat on the porch, staring out at the stars. Scout lay at his feet, chewing on an old rope toy. Travis had called earlier with some news. More dogs like Scout, dogs who had been tossed aside. Dogs who had survived things they shouldn't have had to survive, and they needed somewhere to go. Ethan had said yes before Travis even finished asking. He reached down, running a hand over Scout's fur. "Looks like we've got work to do. Bud?" The collie lifted his head, staring at Ethan with sharp, intelligent eyes. He didn't flinch, he didn't hesitate. He understood. Ethan smiled. They weren't just surviving anymore. They were starting over. Together.